Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today as co-host, Chris Rossini. Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. Good to be with you this morning. I want to talk about medicine. That's hot in the news, and it looks like it's going to be hot in this coming up campaign because there was the candidate in New York that beat Crowley. And the young lady that did that ran on a socialist program, socialized medicine, everything for free. So is socialism going to take over? That's the big question. And of course, Bernie has been arguing that case anyway. So they want to socialize medicine, and that's what we want to deal with because they want it free for everybody. Now, that sounds very good. Some people end up with free stuff, but it's usually stolen if they think it's free. And, I start with this whole issue of medical care as, taxation is theft. And when you steal from one person, give it to another, the government's participating in theft. Sometimes I think the politician is nothing but defense. He's taking stolen goods from one person and passing it out. But in the end, their goal of giving free medical care never works out, and that's where the real problem is because nobody benefits from this except maybe the fence and the people who distribute wealth and get political benefits and the special interest. The other thing, Chris, that I want to emphasize today is the argument that we have to defend the system that we have. And they say, look at what we have, it's such a mess. There's monopolies controlling this and the cost is so high and people can't afford it. And you can't deal with that unless you understand corporatism and corporations being involved and corporate welfare, inflationism, and all these things which has created a monstrous medical system. So I think I would start off by saying the people who are complaining about what we have are correct. They should complain, but they're 100% wrong in saying, well, the problem is we don't have enough government. I think the basic problem, Chris, that we face is that we've already had too much government involvement in medicine.
Oh, yes, and you could compare it to when you were practicing medicine, how much it has changed. And as bad as government has made it, they can always make it worse, and that's the problem. And when it comes to free, this is just basic economics. Take like a supermarket. Let's say a prime rib is $10, $15, but for one day they make it free. By the time you get to the supermarket, it's gone. The shelves are empty. So you could have had it for $10, but now that it's free, you're not going to get it at all. And the same would happen with medicine. If it's free and you don't have to worry about costs, you get a blister, and do you have to go to the doctor? No, but it's free. So you head in there, and that's the problem that they always have is waiting lists. People waiting at the VA, terrible waiting lists. In other countries, they can't get to the dentist, so they pull their own teeth. And government then makes it even worse by rationing. So now a bureaucrat is going to tell you when you can get your operation. And we even had price controls in this country. And think about what they did with the long lines. They went by license plates. If your license plate ends in an even number, then you can get gas on these days. That's how it's a sliding scale downwards. And we have to avoid that.
Right. Not too long ago, I was talking to a progressive, a reasonable person that just saw the shortcomings of Medicare costs too much and he doesn't have the money, and therefore the government should do something about it. But he wasn't the typical demagogue that we hear, the politician, yelling and screaming, we just have to. But when I had a reasonable question in the discussion, I said, how would you pay for it? And his answer was, you tax the 1%. The wealthy people, they have way too much. I mean, look at where Apple is today. $1 trillion? Why don't we just tax the wealthy people and solve all the problem? But when this episode yesterday of Apple becoming a $1 trillion business, I thought, well, yeah, there you go. They have $1 trillion, so why don't we just transfer that to medical care and let somebody else worry about Apple? And I thought, well, yeah, that $1 trillion would take care of our spending deficit barely for 1 year, and that's going to be solve the problem. But that's how simplistic they think about it, is just transferring that over, and they have it. But the whole thing is is they don't look at the problems, and the problems I see is way too much government involvement. One of the biggest programs that has created this monster in our pharmaceutical industry was done by the Republicans, prescription drug program. And I remember that vote very clearly. We had to stay up about 4 or 5 hours just to vote on it because they didn't have the votes, and they had to twist some arms. I thought one time they were going to break some arms. They were twisting so hard. But they finally got it passed by a vote or two and introduced this notion. And now there's monopoly control, of the drug prices. And drugs are a monster of a position. But whether you look at the drug program or whether you look at the insurance program, there's so many people benefiting. Medical management company, the medical professions, the laboratories, they all have one goal, and that is to have third-party payment. The more the merrier, and no price controls, and nobody has any incentive left to try to be frugal. The patient has no ability nor incentive to cut back. And this is the reason that I started practicing medicine when I remember where doctors generally had a doctor-patient relationship, and they had to look the patient in the eye and say, well, this is what it's going to cost you. And you know what? I think the doctors generally charged the least amount that they could afford to do it, and yet, especially people who needed help. Today, everybody charges the most, the maximum amount, because it's third party. It started with insurance company. They're in bed with the government. Then also, the government's going to pay for this. And then they don't have enough money, and the cost goes up, the quality goes down, and then they say we need more regulation. It's a monster. But we have corporatism, corporate welfare involved in the medical system, and just saying, well, what we need is free Medicare for everyone. And when we looked at those figures, it turns out that it's over a 10-year period, it's going to be $31 trillion it's going to cost. Well, we're going to run out of steam by then. It's just not going to be available, and they'll print the money because they can't collect enough money. In spite of the so-called boom in the economy, there's not enough wealth out there to turn it over to the government and let government be involved. But this isn't the only system that suffers, but this is the one that's a big issue. Looks like it's going to be in the campaign. It would be sad if the several candidates that are running on socialized medicine and free medicine for everybody, if they start winning, we will have a much bigger job. But our job is try to get the information out. Do you get the people understand why medicine costs too much? It's related to what the government's already doing, but it's related to inflation. And there's so many things that involved. But the one thing is there's no market. There's no market forces, no competition. And right now, the people, there was a doctor report the other day. He wanted to go out and he says, these MRIs cost so much money. I'm going to buy a machine and reduce the cost because $6,000, $7,000 to have an MRI. And he was turned down. You're not allowed to buy one. That would put too many in your community, and we have to keep up. We don't want too many. That cuts down on the we don't want any competition. And that's the way the hospitals work. If you want to build a standalone clinic next door where you can have a surgery center, then you can get blackballed and not be able to do it. So it's way too much involved already. And now people are asking for more of this. Well, believe me, it's not going to work. It'll just make it much worse.
Yes, there's nothing more expensive than when government says it's going to give you something for free. Nothing is more expensive. And as I mentioned, it would be very hard to get care because obviously the waiting list, it's free after all. So my assumption is that black markets would take care of people. So you better get to know a doctor real quick. Maybe he can moonlight on the side. And it's kind of like drugs, stuff that's done on the side. It's not as safe, and it's going to cost you a lot of money to get it done. So, or you better know a politician that could take care of you, maybe get you that operation because the waiting list is too long. So there's a reason for prices. Prices balance out supply and demand. To say that it's going to be free is to invite total disaster.
Boy, that's for sure. And the concept of insurance has to be challenged too, because they say this is government insurance. You know, they have flood insurance and they have deposit insurance. Everything government wants to appeal to the masses with, they call it, well, this is insurance, you pay into it and we take care of it. Well, that eliminated what you suggested, the pricing structure. Nobody knows what the price should be of the insurance. And then people make big mistakes. And insurance for medical care, especially since Obamacare was passed, it has nothing related to insuring in people. It just said that, you know, your prior conditions don't, you know, can't count, and they can't price it. You know, it turns out that it's actually a form of welfare distribution where they call it insurance. But the elimination of what you suggest, Chris, is that when you lose the market of the supply and demand and people being responsible and people being making difficult decisions. But here we have now the bureaucrats, especially since Obamacare, they're more likely who are looking at that costs become important, but only to the government, not to the patient. The patient always suffers. But now, you know, how do people pay for certain medical services when they're elderly? They might have a rule. Well, there's not enough kidney machines, and if you're over 75, you don't get to use the machine. And they regulate it more. They would say, well, you're too old to get the medication, or you're too sick to have it, and it eliminates the voluntary factor of where some of these problems have been worked out in the past. So I cannot see any chance that government can improve this other than getting out of the way. They're just a big problem. They're responsible for all the over expenses, and it's not going to be cheaper, and there is going to be somebody that has to pay. And you say, well, yeah, it's those 1%ers, we're going to just take the money. But I tell you what, there's a lot more victims than just the ones who get stuck with the bill. The patients are the biggest victims of this. We know about that in the VA hospitals. The real victims are the patients who get this, they lose their care, and they lose the doctor-patient relationship. So the patients are really suffering. They don't get anything for free. They just get a mess, and this thing keeps getting worse, and it really breeds a disaster in Washington. The lobbyists are flocking there. I mean, they whether they're the drug industry, the insurance industry, the laboratory industries. I had one example of when the labs, the doctors' labs were regulated by the federal government. I had a little lab in my office, and I could do about 20 tests, some chemical tests and blood sugars and cholesterols and hemoglobins and all these things I could do at about 10% of the cost that the laboratories did. Oh, but I wasn't to be trusted with my patient. So the people who wanted to protect the patients, had universal laboratory control from Washington, and they moved in. The one thing I remember about that is the day after the lab bill passed and we had to set up and be prepared, there were companies already there, the vultures, who say, I know this is difficult. You have to fill out tons and tons of paperwork, and you have to have all these regulations. We'll take over for you and fill it out, and we'll do your lab tests for you too. So the big labs were all behind that. So the doctors then were expected to send all the labs to the big lab. Well, I sort of practiced a little bit of resistance there because that was way too much for me. But they all are in bed together, and there's usually some special interest behind it, and whether it's the insurance companies or just the drug companies are probably one of the worst. The head of HHS is worked for Eli Lilly. And so it's incestuous in that way. So everything is built into the system right now for it to fail. And the bad people want it to fail because they say that, no, it should be one-party payment. It should be totally socialized medicine. We need authoritarianism. We don't need any of this messing around with freedom of choice and thinking the free market can take care of it. People ask me, well, what could I do? I said, I would distribute medical services and medical care like we distribute cell phones. Have you ever thought about what it would be like if the government had total control of the distribution of cell phones since they were first invented? Believe me, they would be pretty lousy and pretty expensive, and not the poor people wouldn't have it. Poor people have good cell phones and they can afford it. They have computers and all these things that are left to the market, and the prices go down. But no, in medical care, government's going to help, and the prices go up and the quality goes down. So, Chris, I don't know why we don't win this argument, but I think we have to keep plugging away.
Yes, I agree, and you are totally right. But in order to have a marketplace, government has to get out, just as you said. But the mentality in America is backwards these days. It's government has to do something, do something, do something. And they just make things worse. Government has to get out and let prices do what they do. Just like they, when they did the price controls on gasoline, there were long lines. Once the price controls were lifted, the lines went away. But people, they're afraid of the solution. They're afraid of freedom, afraid of free markets, and they just want the government to just add another layer of pain. And that cycle has to be broken. But you have to understand why free it's a scam, basically. And if you understand that, you won't fall for it.
Well, very good. And let me go ahead and close now, because we're up against a lot of odds, and that is the demagogues, the political demagogues that think they can get a position by passing out free stuff. But it also represents what has been taught in our universities. The Keynesian model of economic policy, teaches that deficits don't matter, the government has to be there, printing money is okay, there is no such thing as price inflation due to the government, that's due to profiteering. It goes on and on. So we have a tough job competing with that. But why is it that we can't compete with the ideas that destroy countries with socialism? There's too many examples. I thought we were going to really have a little bit of easy sailing after the collapse of communism in 1990. And we did gain some grounds, but the corporatism is now in the process of totally replacing communism, and that is a form of fascism where big business and government get together and run the show. It's authoritarian, it's a little bit different, and some people are deceived in thinking, oh, this is freedom. We have much more freedom than a total socialist society goes. So even if it doesn't go socialist and the government takes over in pure socialism, it's very socialistic, it's fascistic, and it's corporatism. It has to be challenged, and it should be challenged because this system isn't working. But it will not be challenged and let the people understand. And Chris, you made one suggestion that generally these conditions will fester, and the black market will turn up. And that's where the real market is. Even in the Soviet system, there was black market medicine. It always happens. People need to look at that, and that's the real market where there is competition and people have something to benefit by, and that they can challenge it, and that they can suffer the consequences if we don't do the right thing. Competition, we shouldn't be afraid of it, and we should never be intimidated by those who say too much freedom is bad for you. You have to sacrifice freedom to be safe and secure and have free health care. That's a bunch of baloney. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.